Hello, this is Naomi George signing on. I'm excited to present to you about arena setup. Just a little background, something that I've noticed is that more and more therapeutic riding instructors have not taught formal riding lessons or have not taken formal riding lessons. So it seems like we get into this place in the therapeutic riding industry of just kind of putting a bunch of stuff out in the arena. I even heard someone say one time they have to put so many things out because it's better for their riders to meet more objectives per lesson. And I was kind of like, well, maybe. So we're just going to take a look at some pretty basic arena setups just so that we can take a second to scale back and really think about why are we doing what we're doing? Why are we putting that one ground pole exactly to the left? It seems tedious, but it really makes a big difference. So I love that I called this presentation Arena Setup for Success. And our goal is to set our riders up for success, our volunteers up for success, and our horses too have to be set up for success. Just a little bit about me. Here are some pretty crazy pictures. I've been teaching horseback riding for over 15 years. I've worked at therapeutic riding centers such as eQuest in Texas, Colorado Therapeutic Riding Center in Colorado. I'm currently at Heartland in Kansas City, and I also have a consulting business called eCoach International, where we do distance mentoring for professionals in the equine assisted activities and therapies world. I find more and more that there's just not a lot of accessible one-on-one education. So it's really my goal to help any professional in our industry get what they want out of education. I am a PATH International Advanced Instructor. I'm an interactive vaulting instructor. I'm a mentor, a site visitor. I'm really passionate about EAAT education. I kind of think of myself as an instructor advocate. You know, what can we do to get our instructors, our staff, our professionals to the highest level of programming possible? So I'm a big proponent of group riding lessons. It's a great use of center resources. It balances our facility, finances, the instructor's time, all these ways to get more clients served in the same amount of time. But it is going to be up to the instructor to ensure a high quality lesson for each individual in the group. But you have to teach to the group. You can't just work with each person individually and give, 4 riders 15 minutes of your time and say, oh, well, that was an hour. We have to keep everybody moving and everybody engaged and everybody meeting their goals and maybe even objectives. I see a lot of therapeutic riding instructors struggle to teach a cohesive group lesson. I feel like that individualized instruction to the riders and the volunteer causes confusion. It disrupts the flow. It hampers riders' progression. And at the end of the day, it's really exhausting to the instructor. If you have to repeat yourself 4 times, maybe even more per lesson, you're going to be infinitely more tired than if you could just say it one time and say it effectively to everybody. I also want everybody to remember that our participants have communication barriers. They have learning differences. They have specific teaching and learning styles. They need clear directives. So the more we try to pile up on them, the more confusing it can get. Also, remember our volunteers have limitations, maybe hearing limitations, visual limitations. They don't know a ton about horses, or they think they know a ton about horses. So it's important that we as the instructor be the ones giving the skill-based instruction and let the volunteer be able to facilitate and make that happen. So does this sound familiar? Oh, just leave what you have up. We'll use it. Or the arena setup for every class this week is, how about, I'll just take them on a trail ride. And then my favorite, which I really have heard things like this before, is, okay, let's see. Bobby, stop at the first pile of poop. Jenny, stop 4 steps past the purple gate. And Tommy, trot now, now, now. So we can laugh about it, but these are all very real phrases. I've said them myself. Probably every single one of these I've said myself. Doesn't make me a bad instructor. It just makes room for learning and growing. So I want us to remember that our lesson needs to be centered around a skill-based objective. Each lesson component should lead directly to that objective. This is going to ensure clear progression within the lesson. So we might start with looking at our riders. Does this objective work for these riders? What about for these horses? Is this an objective that these horses can obtain? If your objective is to canter and none of your horses can canter, you might have some problems. What about equipment? Are we just learning to trot and maybe we need an extra handhold? What about our mounting order? Who needs to get on first and last so that we can meet our objective? Arena setup circled in orange because we're going to get to that later. What about warm-up? I try to think of warm-up as preparing the rider's body to meet the objective. If our objective is about halting and backing, I might warm up my hands and my arms to get that part of their body all ready to ride. If we're doing posting, I might really concentrate on a leg warm-up so that my rider's legs are all ready to work out. Review is a really important one. Review reminds the riders what they have already accomplished. That's a stepping stone towards their new skill. So review does actually not mean what did we do last week or what did we do last session. It's actually what do we already know. That's a piece of the skill that we're working towards as our objective. And we'll look at review a little bit more in depth in just a couple slides. So then our skill progression is going to have our task analysis, a little bit about our lesson flow, how are things going to go from our review into getting through our objective. In the skill place, there may or may not be an activity. I don't love the word activity because it's kind of like a cheap way out. I might think of it a little bit more as an exercise. What exercise are we going to do to practice our new objective that we've just learned? So your riders might practice the objective, which is meeting the objective, or they might progress in the skill and even exceed their objective. Cool down is going to be a chance for the riders to reflect on the skill. Sometimes I get lazy and I just ask my riders to walk a lap. But really, I want to give them an opportunity to think about what they just learned and to start transitioning out of riding and back into their daily life. And then, of course, in gray, I have self-reflection written. It is important as an instructor to reflect on your lesson. And one of the key things you're going to reflect on is, did my riders meet the objective? And why or why not? It's not wrong if we didn't meet the objective. It just means there might be room for us to adjust how we're teaching, what we're teaching, why we're teaching it. So it's just time for critical thinking. So some people say, who cares about the arena setup? Whatever's out there, I'm going to use. We'll figure it out. You saw those phrases earlier. I feel like the arena setup is often overlooked. And I feel like in our industry, there are so many variables that we cannot control. I can't control my horse's soundness. I can't control my volunteer's attitude. I can't control what my riders had for lunch. So everybody comes into our arena with all these different factors that are just so far out of the realm of my control. The one thing that I really can control is my arena setup. I can put things exactly where I need them to be so that my horses can successfully make it around and exercise, so my volunteers don't forget where they're going, so my riders can be more independent. So we're going to look at some arena setups, and I kind of have some of these listed as like arena setup, who cares? But let's think about some questions to hone in on what is the difference between a well-designed arena setup and just kind of a meh, okay arena setup. So looking at these two pictures, I might ask myself, does the setup directly reinforce the objective? I had a student instructor who was a really great student instructor. She was a great student instructor. But one of her lesson plans was practicing a 2-point, and her way of practicing it was through a cloverleaf barrel pattern. So we want to make sure that what we're asking our riders to do in terms of riding skill is something that actually goes with it in the real riding world. I wouldn't necessarily practice a 2-point position as I'm riding from barrel to barrel in a barrel pattern. What I might practice is my direct rein steering. So making sure that the setup actually helps the riders meet the objective is going to be really important. Now, a really good example in looking at these two setups is, will the riders and volunteers effectively see and understand the markers provided without constant reminders? The arena on the left is 3 blank barrels. Just by adding a couple cones and some numbers, I'm able to transform my arena setup from me traffic copying my riders through a pattern and volunteers to all of a sudden kind of it making sense. We've got 1, 2, and 3, so you know your barrel order. We've got some cone gates at the bottom, so you know where to start and end. And I went ahead and put a red cone for a right turn and a blue cone for a left turn. That way, they can try to really solidify in their mind which way to go. That leaves me, as the instructor, available to give posture and position corrections, as well as other feedback to my riders on their actual riding, not just where they're going. Ooh, this is a great one. So the first arena that pops up, I don't even know what the riding skill is. There are some cones in the middle of the arena. And I want to re-emphasize that all of these arena setups that I'm going through in this presentation and all of the quotes that I pull out are real life, guys. I've seen this, I've heard this, and a lot of times I've done it. So it's not just that I'm amazing and perfect, it's here's what I've learned. So on the left, we have just some cone shoots, I guess you could call it. All of a sudden on the right, I'm starting to see that maybe we're working on a 3-loop serpentine. And now I have colored ground poles that are serving as a guide for my riders. I have some cones that help them go all the way to the rail. So now we're starting to get to the nuances of what are we actually accomplishing in a serpentine. We have to have straightaways where the poles are, and we have to have curves where the cones are. So this is a great example of asking yourself the question, will the riders and volunteers effectively see and understand the markers provided without constant reminders? Now we're going to take a look at 3 arena setups that on paper look exactly the same. We have 4 white cones, 1 in each corner, 3 ground poles with colored matching cones on either side. But if you take a look at the placement of the ground poles, we're actually challenging our riders in different ways. We're asking our horses for different athletic abilities. And depending on who your volunteers are, we may or may not be asking them for too much. So some questions with these arena setups are, is the setup conducive to the horse's athletic abilities? If you look at the arena setup in the middle, depending on the width of your arena, some horses might not be able to make that turn, depending on their age and maybe your rider's abilities too, and their speed. What about your volunteers' athletic abilities? Are your volunteers able to trot over ground poles? Or do your volunteers need to walk over the ground poles? Because if we trotted them, we might trip. And it can be very program specific and very volunteer specific. Another question that comes up here is, how can the space be maximized to ensure the riders continue moving throughout the lesson? The arena setup on the left that has ground poles on the outside rail can really help riders keep moving around and around on the rail, giving them a lot of space. The arena setup in the middle might use less space unless you change directions after coming up center line every time. Not all riders are up for that. That could be a lot of directionality challenges that come up there. Finally, the setup on the right shows ground poles across a diagonal. Are you really able to exercise your riders and your horses equally in both directions with this setup? It doesn't make it wrong, it just makes it a factor. One other piece to consider is, how can the instructor effectively provide feedback to the individuals in real time while teaching to the group? That's going to come up a lot more as we're looking at some minor changes to our arena setups, like putting an exercise in one spot versus 2. So we'll look at that one a little bit later. Remember, guys, all of these questions should be taken into account when setting up your arena. So a lot of people ask me, what do I do first? Do I come up with this, ultimate game that I read online that's gorgeous and amazing and beautiful and creative? Or do I have an objective or a riding skill first? And I am here to tell you that ideally we would start with an objective or a riding skill that we're working on. But I do understand that in the real world, we might be kind of stuck with somebody else's setup, or we might have to compromise our setups if we're teaching alongside another instructor, maybe sharing the arena, or going right before or right after another instructor. I also recognize the value and validity in seeing somebody else's really cool game or activity. There's that word again, activity or exercise, and kind of stealing it and seeing what you can pull from it. But I just want us to get, from a basic standpoint, very objective and riding skill centered. We need to move away from occupying our riders' times and move towards teaching them the skills of riding so that they can do it as independently as possible. I kind of think of my riders as Anybody can be an independent rider. It doesn't matter what your learning challenges or communication challenges or physical challenges are. Everybody can be independent. However, what changes is the timeline. Some people's timeline for developing independence may be longer than their lifespan. That doesn't mean they can't do it. It just means they may pass on before they're able to accomplish it. So if we as instructors give up on their ability to ride independently, we've really given up on them as a rider. So let's reverse our thinking, or I guess re-forward our thinking back to those objectives, those riding skills. So we're going to look at how to break down a riding skill and then develop some arena setups from there. So we want to create level-appropriate, skill-based activities or exercises. I think this is a big challenge for instructors. So the first thing we want to do is start with a riding skill. And then we're going to break that riding skill into all of its components, every little thing that makes up a riding skill. That's called task analysis. Most of you guys probably have heard of that before. Once we have all these components, and there could be way more than 4, guys, we're going to evaluate which components have already been mastered by our riders. Those are going to be covered in the review section of our lesson plan. And which components are brand new to our riders. And that's going to be covered in the skill portion. So let's look at a real... We're going to take the 2-point position. I'm going to break it down into a pretty simple 3-part task analysis. Part 1, we're going to shorten our reins. Part 2, we're going to put our hands to the mane. Part 3, we're going to stand up out of the saddle. In order to identify which pieces are review and which pieces are newly to be learned, I'm actually going to look a little further at each component. Underneath shortening reins, I have identifying your reins, how to hold your reins, how to adjust your reins, and the difference between shortening and lengthening. Those are all great skills that may have already been mastered before we learn 2-point and could be a really awesome review for this class. That review would directly lead into practicing a 2-point. For hands to the mane, I'm going to need my riders to identify the mane. They're going to need to know where on the mane to hold. And one that comes up a lot is they need to know to hold the reins and the mane. Again, those are options that could be reviewed, or some of them might just be part of learning our skill in the next section of the lesson plan. Under stand up, I have identify stirrups, appropriate foot position in the stirrup, and lower leg alignment. Hopefully, those are all reviews before we get to 2-point. That doesn't mean that your review section has to be 30 minutes long. It's just an idea of some pieces that you can review to build up to the skill of 2-point. And also, your skill could be putting these 3 things together. Maybe you can review each of them independently, and then your riders can practice putting all 3 together to develop the 2-point. So we have our skill, we broke it out, we have our review, and we have our new tasks. How do we develop this quote-unquote activity? Or my new favorite word is exercise. So I want us to really think clearly about our skill progression, because that is going to directly influence our exercise and, of course, our arena setup. So you can easily think, okay, we'll do it at the halt, we'll do it at the walk, we'll do it at the trot, done. But let's be a little bit more concrete than that. We're going to do it at the halt for a specific amount of time. We're going to do it at the walk for an identifiable distance. We're going to do it at the trot for an identifiable distance. Maybe your class isn't ready to trot and you want to skip trotting and do ground poles at the walk. What about if your class is amazing and they're ready to do ground poles at the trot? Do you do that the first day you teach 2-point? Or is that maybe week 10 of practicing 2-point? How about the difference between steering while maintaining a 2-point and sitting between the ground poles to steer to ground poles? So again, do you hear how each of these different types of ways to practice 2-point can lend to very different arena setups? And they're also going to lend to some very concrete like signs in our arena, or markers, I think is the right word, markers in our arena. Not just a pile of poop that happened to occur there, but actually a specifically yellow colored cone so that I can tell everybody at the yellow cone, this is what's going to happen. So I'm going to just show an example of an arena setup and how in just one class and with just one setup, I can accomplish a lot of different things. So my class might start with practicing 2-point on the ground. So I'm going to start on the left. And I might have my riders start by holding their 2-point from the red cone to the green cone. Or if not everybody can do it, we have a blue set in the middle. So you can go from red to blue or blue to green. Notice how my ground poles are already there. They're just pushed to the side. I know that I'm going to use them in this class. So therefore, I have them out and ready to go. Once my class has a good grasp of 2-point, I'll put the ground poles in a straight line and have them hold their 2-point all the way over the ground poles. Again, we can do different things with this setup. We can practice sitting down and getting back up into 2-point between each ground pole. We can practice holding our 2-point the whole way. We can talk about why 2-point is so exciting and so important, because maybe we sit down on our horse's back over the ground poles and our horse hits all the poles. And then we do it in our 2-point and my riders can't hear their horses hitting the poles anymore. Or if you're like my horses, they hit them no matter what, but that's just because they're so great. Next, on the right, I've just moved one of the ground poles a little bit, and I've really opened the door to possibilities within my progression. I could ask a rider to maintain their balance in the 2-point while their leader steers them over the 3 ground poles. I can ask my riders to practice steering while holding a 2-point. So maybe they'll hold on to the mane with one hand and steer with the other and then switch. I might ask my riders to practice 2-pointing over the ground pole, sitting, steering, 2-pointing over the ground pole, sitting, and steering. This way, I can have the same arena setup for the most part, just with very simple little changes, and get through a pretty long and complete progression. I can also have different activity levels, different exercise levels for different levels of riders, depending on what my group looks like. Because, of course, not all of our groups are perfect. Now, we're going to just look at some general arena setups and decide in what situations might certain setups be helpful or not helpful. So we're going to look at some pros and cons of general setups. The first one is keeping our exercise set up along the rail. So if you look on the left, you can see some cone gates that riders would kind of zigzag as they steer between the colored cone pairs. And we have it on the left, it's along the rail, and on the right, it's up center line. So a pro to having it on the rail is crowd control. It's pretty easy to keep everybody moving when we're all walking on the rail and our exercise is on the rail, and people can just circle or cut across as needed. It's also a pretty good use of space because everybody can keep moving on the rail. This also tends to be easier for horses and riders. The horses are pretty good at following the rail, hopefully, and they have a tendency to keep moving on the rail, hopefully. Our riders do a little less steering, trying to tell our horse exactly where to go when there's a rail there to guide them. But there are some drawbacks. Keeping exercises on the rail can be repetitive, and it may lack progression. There might not be enough opportunity for your riders to practice their steering with the setup on the left, although there are things you can do with it. If we have our exercise in the middle, this does add a level of difficulty. A lot of programs have their horses stop in the middle to dismount. So how many times when your horse comes to the middle do they think, great, class is over, I can stop? It could be a good challenge for your riders to have to use their legs to keep their horse going. Or it might be too much of a challenge for some riders. There's also more opportunity for space utilization if we come up center line. If you can have your class change directions every time they come up center line. Otherwise, we're just circling in half the arena as if it was a rail on center line. This can also help bring riders towards the middle where the instructor is. That way, riders are coming to you, so you can give them individualized attention when they're near or closest to you. Something to remember about exercises in the middle is that without the rail guiding the way, sometimes it can just look like a smush of cones or poles. It's not always so clear where to go and what to do. So you want to make sure and have a visual demo or very clear directions or a really good leader leading the pack so that everybody is really clear on where to go. Now we're going to see what happens if the objective is attempted in one place versus two places. Something great about attempting your objective 2 times in 2 places of the arena, is that there's more opportunity for kinesthetic learning, which most of us know is the highest level of learning. A big drawback, though, could be a safety consideration. I like to think that the 2 F's need to happen right in front of the instructor. And my 2 F's are falling and failure. So we want to keep the hardest thing happening right where the instructor is. So having 2 attempts might work really well at the walk, but what if we're trotting? Is it really a good idea to have our beginning trot riders or our off-balance riders trotting behind our backs? We really need to have our eye on that. Another thing to consider with looking at 1 attempt versus 2 attempts is our riders' processing and cognition abilities. Some riders really benefit from having extra processing time. Or what about a break? Just a talking break, a chatting break, a social break. What about our volunteers and our horses? Do they need a break? They probably need to walk just as much as your riders might need a chance to just catch their breath or catch up with their cognition, catch up with their processing. So sometimes while you may view it as boring to have like a gap in activity, it could be your rider's favorite part because their brain gets to take a break. then again, we just might consider the 1 attempt versus 2 with different types of skills. So now, what about a more stationary skill or activity? We saw an activity that might, an exercise that might occur while moving at the walk or the trot. But here, let's look at a quarter turn in a box. How does that change your choice of setting it up for 1 attempt versus 2 attempts? Because coming into a box and stopping can give the instructor quite a bit of time to give feedback, one and then the other, as well as a great opportunity to help keep riders moving, because this is not so much of a high intensity, high movement activity. On a side note, I want us to take a look at the setup for this quarter turn in a box. If we look at the single attempt on the left, I want you to take a moment to think about which way your rider should be tracking to complete this objective of a quarter turn in a box while maintaining the maximum flow, the maximum movement in the arena. I'm going to see if I can figure out how to use these drawing pieces here while you're thinking about it. Okay, so if we are tracking left on this rail, then we can come in at the green, halt, then turn out at the red and continue on the left. I'll put an arrow so that we can remember. This is going to use the space the most. Excuse me, that did not sound very clear. This is going to use the most amount of space. The only part of our arena that it is not using is this little pocket right here, which could be a place for somebody who needs a timeout or an adjustment or something, or just a place that we're not using right now. Let's see if I can delete this. Ooh, perfect. Look at how swanky this is. So let's for a second say we were tracking to the right. If we were tracking to the right and we wanted to enter at green and exit at red, we're going to end up coming along the rail, tracking right, enter at green, halt, turn at red, and uh-oh, who are we going to run into? Everybody else in the class who's trying to move through the exercise. So some people may say, Naomi, this looks like a better use of space because it uses the whole arena, because we could continue going down and around. However, from the standpoint of human traffic, human flow, this is actually not going to be the most ideal setup. So let's take a second to look at our exercise on the right. Let me delete all of this. So we're going to look at this exercise on the right and ask the same question. Which is the best way to track in order to maximize the space utilized? If you think it's tracking to the right, you are correct, because we'll be able to continue on the rail, come in at the green, exit at the red, and hang a right again. Wow, those are some ugly arrows. Do you guys see how this really maximizes the human flow around the arena so that we're not doubling back and running into each other? Now, another piece that I just want us to really think about is if we change directions on the rail, but keep our arena set up exactly the same, Are we actually able to practice our quarter turn in both directions? I'll say that one more time. If our riders change direction on the rail, but we don't change our colored cone placement in our box, do our riders actually practice a quarter turn in both directions? And the answer is no. If we're tracking right, I'll start over here. If we're tracking right, we're still going to come in at green and exit at red. If we're tracking left, do you see how that's a right-hand turn? If we're tracking left, we're still going to come in and do a right-handed turn. So we really didn't change directions in our skill. So we might not have met our objective if our objective says to do a quarter turn in each direction, even though we changed directions on the rail. So what you'll want to make sure and do is just flip sides of where your green cones are to make sure that you can go in both directions. A couple other considerations to take into account when working on your arena setup is going to be, how do our riders maintain spacing? Do you want them to circle, which is not always the best for the horse? Should they break gait, which might be frustrating for the riders? Remember, our riders' hardest time is in transitions. That includes transitions up and down through gates. What about cutting across the arena? There might be stuff in the way. Maybe it's a good challenge. Maybe it's not a good challenge. So just really think about your rider's needs, because a rider who's very unsteady and unbalanced may do best halting, but a rider who needs to go, go, go may do best cutting across the arena. What about who keeps track of all of the attempts? Is it your riders or your volunteers, or is it you? Make sure you let them know if it's the riders or the volunteers, because otherwise you won't remember how many times Sally trotted. And just because your rider might not speak up that it's still their turn doesn't mean it won't make them sad to miss out, or jealous if somebody else gets an extra one. So when preparing for a lesson, I really encourage instructors to visualize the lesson flow and how that lesson flow rolls around your arena setup. So at what point in the arena should the riders change directions or line up or complete their warm-ups or get a tack check? Of course, we have to allow for flexibility in the moment, but if you start with a clear picture, I find it really helps you as an instructor stay calm, cool, and collected during the lesson, especially when things don't go as planned. I also say, when in doubt, let your riders walk a lap on the rail so that you can take a breath and collect your thoughts, and let your arena setup guide you in where you need your riders to be when. So I'm going to look at 3 lessons with very similar arena setups, just some minor changes, and we're going to look at how our objective can stay the same, our warm-up can stay the same, lots of pieces can stay the same, but just because our arena setup changes, it really affects the skill level that we're asking for, the type of rider that's working in this. So let's look together. Our first lesson, our objective is that our riders will complete 2 trot to walk transitions. I'm going to have my riders warm up by singing row, row, row your boat and practicing the row, row, rowing hand motion. Excuse me, I whacked the computer. My riders are going to review that their lower leg tells their horse to go and their hands tell their horse to whoa. That means we're going to review walk to halt to walk transitions. Now, my skill, which this is the skill portion of my lesson plan, it doesn't mean that a traffic light is the skill that I'm teaching. It means that the skill portion of my lesson plan is going to utilize the traffic light to meet our objective of completing 2 trot to halt transitions. So on a traffic light, green means go, yellow means prepare or slow down, and red means stop. So I'm going to have my riders complete 1 trot to walk transition down our traffic light. Then we're going to move on to do our 2 trot to halt transitions. And I'm going to draw on here what I mean. I might have my riders lined up down this long side, of course doing a tack check before any trotting. I'll ask my first rider to walk on. At the green cones, we're going to trot on. At the yellow cones, we're going to prepare. And at the red cones, we're going to do our downward transition. To begin with the skill progression, we're going to transition down to a walk, and then we're going to go into a halt. My riders can then walk on to the end of the line. This arena setup allows for pretty good flow around the arena. Even though I have 4 riders lined up in the beginning for my tack check, as we keep moving through the exercise, the line keeps moving, so there's not that much stopping time. And then as an added benefit, I'm going to just demonstrate to you guys that my cool down is really going to bring in my riders' external lives. So I might ask them, do you benefit from a yellow cone to prepare outside of riding? And we can make that simpler and say, does it help when mom gives you a warning before leaving? Or do you like for mom to just say, go, 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 we're leaving? Usually people like warnings. Same with our horses. They also like. Okay, now we're going to take the same objective, the same warm-up, and just adjust our arena setup a little bit so that we're working with more advanced riders. Same skill / activity / exercise, whatever you want to call it. We're still using our stoplight to develop our trot to halt transitions. We're going to warm up with row, row, row your boat. Everybody loves that no matter what age. This time, I'm working with a more advanced crew. So my crew already has practiced backing out of a chute of poles. So we're going to review that, and we have our chute up by our red cone. We're going to practice walking in, halting, and backing out. Now we're going to move into our skill. Remember, our objective is about our trot to halt. Just because they can back out of a chute doesn't mean it's my ultimate focus for the day. On my traffic light, green still means go, yellow prepare, and red halt. So my crew is going to practice by completing 1 trot to halt transition on the rail, so without backing out of the chute, which means I can actually just remove this top pole so that they can practice their halt and then walk on without having to really change much about my arena setup. Then I can put that pole back to continue into my ultimate goal for the class, which is 2 trot to halt to back transitions. So again, my riders might be lined up here. I got, let's say, 4 of them in a class. We're going to walk on. Green means go, so at green we'll trot through a corner. Yellow means prepare, something's coming. In our chute at red, we're going to halt and then actually back out. So it adds another level of difficulty. Same objective. Pretty darn similar arena setup. Even without the chute, just in moving my start position, I'm challenging my riders in a very different way. In this class, I might, for our cool down, ask, what happens to our horse when we prepare ahead of time? So before, I ask them to think about when in their lives they preferred preparation. Now I might ask my riders to bring it back to their horse. What happened? Did it get better? Did it get worse? Did it cause trouble for your horse? All those kinds of things. We want to develop really critical thinking riders, not just robots who can kind of keep their hands up off the saddle and go a little bit. Okay, now we're going to look at the third. We just have some minor changes to our arena. This is not going to be appropriate for all levels. This is going to make it even harder in different ways. Same objective, same warm-up. We're keeping the review the same from last week, but look at how much more challenging our setup is for our riders. So we're still going to review our walk, halt, back up in the chute. We've got our chute right here. For our skill, we still have our traffic light. We still have green. We now have 2 sets of yellow and a red. I might start my riders off getting their trotting warmed up on the rail a little bit before we get to some steering at the trot. So I might have to move my red cones over here so that it looks like some of my old traffic lights were, so that we can get warmed up with our trot on the rail. But once we're all ready to put our pieces together, our review with our new skill that we're working on, again, I have my riders lined up. I've got 4 of them. It's a great place for a lineup because there's plenty of starting room. I really don't like to line up right next to where we have to get rolling. I want them to have room to walk on and think about and prepare what they're going to do. So we're turning our corner. Green means go. So we're going to trot. We're coming through, and look at this. We've got 1 set of yellow preparation cones. What are we preparing for here? How do we prepare for it? What are we preparing for here? Because we've got prep 1, whoopsies, prep 1 and prep 2. Prep 1, we might add legs to keep going through our turn. Prep 2, we're going to start that half halt so that when we get into our chute, we can halt to back out. So afterwards, I might ask my riders to think about the difference in how to prepare your horse for different activities. Preparing for a turn might take a different rider cue than preparing for a halt. In conclusion, creating skill-based lesson plans are what is going to assure our riders' progression within horseback riding. I want you guys to just take a few minutes to plan an appropriate arena setup. And I want you to take into account your instructors, your riders, your volunteers, your horse's success, so that everybody is set up and ready to go. So I want you to start with that skill-based lesson. Start with the riding skill. Start with the objective. Then we're going to make sure that we pick an exercise or an activity, if you like that word, that reinforces this skill. What would you actually see in a riding lesson at any other barn? Finally, I came up with this little phrase of MNMing it. So we're going to maximize our space. We're going to make sure you can navigate easily. And we're going to be able to maintain our flow. So every time you're setting up your arena, how can you use the most amount of space? How can everybody get around and figure out where they need to go? And how can everybody keep moving as much as possible considering the safety piece that is, of course, important. Guys, thank you so much for joining me today talking about arena setup. It's such a tiny little piece of our whole lesson, but I hope you've really figured out how important it is and how it can really set you up for success or, unfortunately, failure in a lot of ways. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. My email address is naomihgeorge@outlook.com. Again, that's naomihgeorge@outlook.com. You can see it posted right above me. Also, be sure to check out my website, www.ecoachinternational.com. I offer a variety of services customized to fit client-specific needs. Are you a current EAAT professional looking to gain or advance certification? Or maybe you're new to the industry. Or maybe you're a center looking for staff development and consultation. No matter what your needs are, I'm here to provide you with guidance every step of the way. Take a look at my website and see what I can do for you. Also, instructors and other professionals, check out the Teaching Tips blog. I'm trying to really expand the blog so that we can hit on lots of different topics that people always want to hear about. If there's a specific topic you want me to write about, just email me. Hope to hear from you guys soon. Have a great day. Bye.